He'll argue, and I think this is a helpful way to approach it, is if you look, say, at the Old Testament books like Genesis or Deuteronomy or other books, what you'll often see is a narrative section that is punctuated by look, say, at the Old Testament conclusion of that narrative section. And in those cases, the poem often distills the theological meaning and significance of the narrative that preceded it. So I'm thinking of Jacob's blessing in Genesis 49, Moses' blessing toward the end of Deuteronomy. We could think of the oracles of Balaam and Numbers. So these are places where the narrative pauses and we have poetic sections that highlight the theological distillation of those passages.
Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. We're joined on the podcast today by Dr. Kyle Dunham to discuss a new book, An Introduction to the Making and Meaning of the Bible by Michael B. Shepherd. Before we do that, I wanted to remind you that Bryce Lecture Series, this is an annual lecture series that happens every year in March that's hosted by our seminary, was announced at our E3 conference. The topic will be on historic versus trauma-informed biblical counseling. We have a debate on these two issues. We hope you can join us. This is a free event, so please put it on your calendar. You can get registered on our website at dbts.edu/rice. Again, that's coming up on March 20th. With that, let's welcome Dr. Dunham to the podcast. Dr. Dunham, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. You recently have written a book review of Michael B. Shepherd's book, An Introduction to the Making and Meaning of the Bible. The review was published in the most recent edition of Jets. And so I thought it'd be a good idea for us to talk through the book. I know you've got some pushback on some of it, but overall, it sounds like from the review you really liked it. Maybe just real quick, give us an overview of the book. What's the central argument?
He's essentially arguing that when we think about the Bible, we need to have a greater understanding of how the Bible came to be. There's sort of this idea that, the Bible, in a sense, almost just dropped out of heaven, fully formed, leather-bound with maps. And so what he's trying to argue is that there actually was a compositional process. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't believe in divine inspiration and inerrancy and all those sorts of things, which we do, but yet at the same time understanding that, particularly in the Old Testament, Dr. Shepherd is an Old Testament professor, that there were often books that maybe had a multi-stage composition. I'm thinking of the book of Proverbs, where you have Solomon, and then you have Hezekiah's scribes copying out different portions of the book. And you can make the case for other books as well that perhaps had the same thing. Psalms being another example, where you have probably a Davidic early collection and then a later collection of all 5 of the Masoretic books in the Psalms.
Yeah, or even there's editorial comments. So like at the end of Deuteronomy,
exactly.
Moses probably didn't write about his own death.
Right. So he's arguing that we need to pay more attention to how the Old Testament is put together, how its final form attests to its message, and just thinking about how books are organized in terms of the content that they're giving. So, for instance, in later chapters, he'll talk about when we're reading a book, we ought to pay attention to what he calls programmatic passages and framing, and these are basically literary devices that authors use to help us interpret the message that they're giving.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of helpful insights I think that he has. I do have a few critiques which we'll get to eventually, but it's a helpful book.
So what are the major sections, and then maybe we'll jump into the first one.
Yeah, so he really divides it into 5 parts. He talks about the making of the Bible, so how Scripture came together. Then he focuses on textual criticism, and he's looking at versions. This is an area where probably in general, Christians maybe don't have an awareness of the different versions that shaped early scriptural interpretation. I'm thinking of the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, other versions that came along. And so he argues for their viability in terms of helping us understand what's going on in the text of Scripture. Then he has a couple of chapters where he looks at the compositional strategy. And this might be a new concept to people as they're hearing this, but basically the idea that if you look carefully at the books of the Old Testament and New Testament, that the authors leave us clues to the bigger picture that they're trying to give a trajectory toward, if that makes sense. So in other words, there's a messianic undertone to a lot of the Old Testament books focusing on that future figure who's to come, who's the Messiah, and this comes to fruition particularly in poetic passages and other places. And then he argues that the same thing is going on in the New Testament. And so he'll kind of weave those two things together. And then in the last chapter is looking at how themes help us to understand Scripture. And he's looking particularly at two themes, the theme of kingdom and the theme of covenant, and arguing that these are like the two major motifs of Scripture that from beginning to end underlie the message it's intending to give us. So thinking about how kingdom and covenant are held in tension. And, again, I would maybe critique that a little bit. I think kingdom precedes covenant, but covenant, of course, is an important concept, so just how you put that together might differ a little bit, but he's trying to look at what are the major themes that we should be able to kind of zoom out from Scripture and think about how is it contributing to this larger macro theme and message.
Yeah. So in the first chapter, he jumps in, focusing he talks about Scripture attends to its own interpretation, and you talk about that micro level and a macro level. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, so he argues that within, on a micro level context, that you can read books and often find editorial comments or authorial comments that help us understand what's going on. Just to give you a couple examples. So as you're reading through Genesis, a lot of times modern translations will put certain comments in parentheses or kind of set them off by dashes to show that this is an authorial comment. So I'm thinking of in chapter 12, when Abram comes into the land, Moses makes the editorial comment, the Canaanites were then in the land. And so that kind of sets, there's a spiritual danger here. There's an animosity toward God's intended salvation blessings through Abraham. So we're aware that there's a tension now between Abraham and those that are in the land. And then we'll see the phrase a lot of times, that is, which is an explanatory comment that the author is making to help understand a location or a geographical name. So for instance, in Genesis 14, we find this where Moses is talking about the war that takes place between these various kings, and sometimes he offers a comment like this, the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Zoar then connects later in chapter 19 to where Lot flees with his daughters, and so there's a contextual tie-in there. Or he'll explain the Valley of Siddim as the Salt Sea, and et cetera. So when we're paying attention on the micro level, we see this in the New Testament. The Apostle John in the Gospel of John will often say things like, the high priest that year said this because he was the high priest, but he didn't understand the implications of what he was saying. So that's an authorial comment that helps us understand what's going on in that particular passage. So paying attention to that on a micro level, and then as we work through Scripture, we'll see that in different areas. I'm thinking of as we go along further. For instance, Deuteronomy 34 ends with the death of Moses. Joshua 1 begins with the death of Moses and God commissioning Joshua. Judges 1 begins with the death of Joshua, but there seems to be no ready replacement to come after Joshua. There's a vacuum of leadership, and that sets the tone then for Judges, where there's a fractured unity among the nations, a lack of faith, a lack of godly leadership. So paying attention to how books begin and end offer clues to the message that those books intend to give us. So he's sort of saying, pay attention to details, but also zoom out and think about the larger ligatures that connect sections and books, and we'll maybe talk more about this, but particularly as we come to the end of a major section like the law or the history books, there are often passages that help us zoom out a little bit and see how this connects to the bigger picture through law, prophets, and wisdom themes.
Yeah, kind of like where we've come from and then where we're headed.
Yeah.
In that sense, like an editorial note. I think this probably speaks to a kind of a larger concept that is helpful. Different people view the Bible differently, and by people I mean believers. Yeah. Right. So some people who've not had formal training tend to think of, and this is very general, but I'll just make the observation. Right. We would say like the Bible is a powerful and alive book. Right. It does the work of God. It is the tool that helps people to see the truth. Right. So we can tend to think of it in very spiritual, if I can say it that way, terms.
Yeah.
But that can sometimes overlook the more physical, I don't know if that's the best way to say that, but more physical aspects of the nature of the book.
Yeah.
Someone at some point wrote those words down.
Right.
Someone copied the words down. Someone made, talking about Moses, right? Yeah, the translation or even editorial comments that were added in. And as the composition comes together, through the amazing way our God works, it was both a human and divine process. Mm-hmm. And it can be easy sometimes to overlook the the more, if I could say it that way, the makeup of the text, the physical components,
Right.
thinking of it only as a spiritual type of book. So a concept like that of look at the macro level, the micro level of the book, think about how it has been compositionally structured to present meaning and promote truth,
Yeah.
is a really helpful concept that I think probably a lot of people, if they think about it, have never really thought of before.
Right, and we don't want to diminish divine inspiration or suggest that these are just human books. We understand
Absolutely.
that historical, critical arguments, would essentially assert that. Rather, we affirm a high view of Scripture, but at the same time, these weren't created in a test tube or in a vacuum. Real people were writing these books in a time and place, and so understanding that there's a historical credibility to these books, and also a consciousness in terms of how they're shaped. And another thing that he brings out along these lines is just paying attention to how Scripture is mutually interpreting. So on the micro and macro level, just to give you an example, if you read in Jeremiah, Jeremiah is having a confrontation with the elders, and they quote Micah of Moresheth and say, in Hezekiah's day, Micah made this prophecy, and Hezekiah didn't kill him, he repented, and so the Lord relented of the disaster. So Jeremiah is interpreting Micah. If you read a little further on, Daniel's interpreting Jeremiah, because in Daniel 9, he's saying, I was reading in Jeremiah, essentially Jeremiah 25:11, that 70 years was allotted and that he realized he was coming to the end of that. And so there's a mutual interpretation happening among the books, which gives us a clue to how we should read those books too. One thing I like to say about Daniel is he's reading Jeremiah very literally as actually saying 70 years, not a figurative idea of multiple generations, but an actual 70-year period. Then if you get into the New Testament, you see this phenomenon as well, where Peter, for instance, in 2 Peter says, they're twisting the letters of Paul as they do the rest of the Scriptures. So there's a recognition that these scriptural books are being written and need to be interpreted carefully, and there's, as it were, a continuum of interpretation among the faithful of God's people.
Yeah. So the next part of the book that he gets into is on text transmission and translation. What are some of the key arguments there?
Yeah, so he argues that when we're thinking about Old Testament in particular, it's a fairly complicated textual history, so we at least need to be mindful, cognizant of the fact that there's a multiplicity of versions that can be consulted with prophet for understanding what the original text of those books were. Now, in this case, it's a little bit more that we could say, some will say it's a specialist kind of approach in the sense that not everybody's reading the Septuagint and all these sorts of things, but what he does, I think, helpfully provide is access to newer works that explain a lot of these concepts. So, for instance, there's an online website you can go to and read an English translation of the Septuagint to use for comparison purposes to the Hebrew Bible, which is the basis for most of the translations in our English versions. And then there's a newer translation of the Syriac Peshitta, which is also another version that's helpful. So he's basically looking at, when we go to the Old Testament, what text should we privilege, and how do we think about decisions of textual criticism? Textual criticism is the art and science of trying to determine what was the original reading in the autograph of Scripture. In the case of the Old Testament, that is its final canonical form of these books, and so thinking carefully through different versions and other things. Now, this is where I do have some pushback against Shepard. He tends, in my mind, to privilege the Septuagint a little bit more than I would, in the sense that he argues that we should use the Septuagint as the basis for some of our books, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. I'm not convinced that's the case, but I think he at least makes a good case for the idea that we ought to pay attention carefully to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, because certainly the early church did, and in some cases, like Jeremiah, it's a very complicated text history for that particular book.
Right. Yeah, maybe could you talk a little bit about what's the differences there? So for folks who might not be aware, we have the Masoretic Text and then the Septuagint. What are those, and why are they important when you start talking about Old Testament textual criticism?
Yeah. So if you read Jeremiah, you can already get a sense that some of this is complicated. So for instance, Jeremiah gives a message to the king, and if you remember this particular story, as the king's hearing it, he takes out his penknife and he begins to cut pieces and throw them into the fire, and his officials are a little bit disturbed by what he's doing, but he's essentially saying, I'm denying the legitimacy of this. As a result of that, the Lord tells Jeremiah to write down those prophecies again and then add others to them. And so you have this sense that the book might have a complicated textual history. Adding to that is the fact that Jeremiah, rather than going to Babylon, he writes to the Babylonians, the Jewish people in Babylon, but he himself is likely taken to Egypt, that there were different versions of the book, possibly that were made. And again, we have to be careful because we believe that there's a divinely legitimized autograph, but at the same time, it seems that there were different versions of Jeremiah. So what he's arguing is the Hebrew text has a particular focus on Babylon in the order of the oracles against Babylon that tends to emphasize Babylon and the destiny of the Jewish people, whereas the Septuagint has a different order, and so the message of it is a little bit different. So I still am in favor of using the Hebrew text, but he's trying to argue that we should pay more attention to how the Greek version has it.
Yeah, so essentially he'd be arguing that the Septuagint goes back to the original or the autograph better than what the current Masoretic text would.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's why we would privilege it.
Yeah, that's what he argues. So
yeah.
Again, because we do understand the Masoretic text is the product of Jewish scribes in the post-Christian era, so
Right.
from about 500 to 1000 AD, the earliest exemplar, depending on how you date it, is Aleppo Codex or Leningrad Codex, but those both date from the 10th or 11th centuries AD. So we're dealing with a very long span of time between that and when the originals were written, and so we do have to think about these different attestations to the text.
Yeah. So that's the chapter on text and transmission, translation, those types of things. Any issues he brings out about translations or anything like that would be important for listeners?
I think just understanding that we ought to be paying attention to a lot of different witnesses, thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, thinking about the Greek translation and other things. And a lot of, we have an embarrassment of riches almost today where we have access to these different translations and sources. You can, for instance, see high-resolution photographs of all the Dead Sea Scrolls online. I mean, a lot of that is going to be written in Hebrew, so you sort of have to have an understanding of the script and all that sort of thing. But we do have a lot of access. So all that to say, we should be well-informed readers of Scripture that don't just trust the experts, but are good stewards ourselves and have an awareness of how the text came to be.
Yeah. So then in the next chapters, he gets into the compositional strategy of the Hebrew Bible. What's the main argument there?
So he argues that this is developing, in a sense, the work of one of his former professors, John Sailhammer, but basically the idea that the writers of Scripture were conscious of a larger program that was pointing toward the Messiah. So, for instance, what he'll argue, and I think this is a helpful way to approach it, is if you look, say, at the Old Testament books like Genesis or Deuteronomy or other books, what you'll often see is a narrative section that is punctuated by a poem that comes at the conclusion of that narrative section. And in those cases, the poem often distills the theological meaning and significance of the narrative that preceded it. So I'm thinking of Jacob's blessing in Genesis 49, Moses' blessing toward the end of Deuteronomy. We could think of the oracles of Balaam and Numbers. So these are places where the narrative pauses and we have poetic sections that highlight the theological distillation of those passages. And so in those particular poetic sections, we often find highly concentrated messianic imagery, suggesting that these books had a forward orientation and eschatological orientation that weren't just about recording the history of ancient Israel, but were prospective in essentially saying that God's redemptive plan is moving toward fruition in the person of the Messiah, and so we ought to read it from that perspective and point of view. And I think that fits nicely with how the New Testament writers themselves read the Old Testament as not just sort of a collection of nice stories and moral precepts for how to live your life, but really were oriented toward the coming Messiah and how he would bring to fruition the promises and prophecies of the Old Testament canon.
Yeah. One group of Old Testament books that can kind of get excluded sometimes when we start talking about redemption is poetry. So like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes can sometimes be hard to fit into that overall compositional strategy, to use his term. How does he examine that? How does he fit those in?
He does a little bit. I think this is an area where still more work needs to be done. A lot of times Old Testament theologies give short shrift to those books. But I think poetic books in general, there's a recognition that within the narrative books, poetry is very key because it does give that theologically concentrated message of what the book is about.
Right.
In the poetic books themselves, where do they fit? I typically connect them to the king who's going to bring God's righteous rule. And so a lot of times I think there's a connection point there. But what he would say, I think, is if we pay attention to the framing and how the books are put together, it gives us a clue to the message of the book. And in that case, it ties in nicely with the theme of these other books.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then that's the Old Testament. He also has a chapter on the compositional strategy of the New Testament. I would assume it picks up on similar themes. How does he continue to develop that?
Yeah, so he argues that, if you understand a correlation between the New Testament and the Old Testament, so we're thinking about how, for instance, the Gospels in a way mirror the Torah, the Mosaic Law, Acts as the history of how the gospel unfolds within the local church mirrors the historical books of the Old Testament. So there's, again, a correlation between foundational documents that point us toward Jesus as the Messiah, a historical account of how that plays out, and then the epistles, which give us commands, imperatives, and counsel for how we ought to live as believers within the context of the local church. So again, this chapter is shorter, but it's essentially arguing that, again, the New Testament authors have a compositional strategy that they're pointing to Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and now the church as his body living out his commands in a way that brings the gospel to the nations.
Yeah. So as you think about the book as a whole, and you think about your review of it, what do you think is for someone who's going to go buy this and read it, what's the value they're going to get out of it?
I think they'll be exposed to a lot of insights and information about how the books of the Bible came to be. This is a question that gets raised, why don't we include, say, the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha? Why are these books in particular the books of the canon? How does scholars talk about the shape of the canon. That's a bit of an abstract concept, but the idea there is that the canon is put together in a way that it takes us as a reader to somewhere, that there's a message and an intent to it. So paying close attention to how these books came to be and how they're hooked together will make us better readers, and I think better interpreters of Scripture, because we'll see the whole and not get lost in the trees and details without seeing the forest.
Yeah, that's great. So that the book is an introduction to the making and meaning of the Bible by Michael B. Shepard, who's a professor at Cedarville, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Dr. Dunham, for your review of the book and for coming on the podcast to talk about it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Theologically Driven. We hope it was helpful for you. If it was, I'd encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss another episode. Theologically Driven is a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you would like to learn more about our seminary, you can go to dbts.edu.